award-winning journalist from Chicago. He's the author of Correction, Parole, Prison, and the Possibility of Change, which was named one of the best books of 2023 by the Washington Post. This important book tells the story of two men, Johnny Veal and Michael Henderson, and their experience within the Illinois parole system. The book also provides important historical context about the parole system and mass incarceration, both locally and nationally. While the book focuses on the ill who are currently incarcerated in Wisconsin's prisons, especially for the approximately 1,600 people who are eligible for parole currently. This powerful book makes us grapple with the concepts of punishment, rehabilitation, and redemption. Prior to the publication of Correction, Ben Austen's book, High Risers, Cabrini Green and the Fate of the American Public Housing, was longlisted for the Andrew Carnegie Medal of Excellence in Nonfiction and named one of the best books of 2018 by Booklist, Mother Jones, and the public libraries of Chicago and St. Louis. Ben teaches creative writing program at the University of Chicago and was a former editor at Harper's Magazine. His feature writing has appeared in a number of publications, including the New York Times Magazine, GQ, Wired, and many, many others. And if that wasn't enough, he's also working on 2 8-part nonfiction Audible original podcasts and is the co-host of a podcast called Some of My Best Friends Are. Please join me in welcoming Ben Austen.
Hey everybody.
Hi.
How you doing?
Good.
Emma, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It's like everything I'm doing, right? And thank you to all of you. Thank you to the Wisconsin Justice Initiative and to Margot and Craig for allowing me to be part of this event. And it's for such an amazing cause, and I'm really, really honored to be here. Among all the things that Emma just said, my work has been taking me to Wisconsin a lot lately, and I've been struck by the community of people, many who are here, who are working to make the system a system more just, the justice system more just. I really appreciate coming to Wisconsin and seeing so much of that. Okay, as you heard, I wrote a book about parole. It's called Correction, Parole, Prison, and the Possibility of Change. Parole, as some of you know, exists in the backwaters of the criminal system. Hearings generally are sparsely attended, and if they make the news, it's usually as sound bites of fear and outrage. And then they disappear from our consciousness. But today, I actually hope to change that a little bit. I want to sort of take you on a journey with me. I want to show you a parole hearing so you can see for yourself how board members make their decisions. Because what they do really tells us about who we are, about who we punish and why. To report my book, I started going to parole hearings in Illinois back in 2019, and I went to every parole hearing. I showed up every month. The parole hearings happen in Springfield, in the state capitol, just a few blocks from the gleaming dome of the state capitol building. You have to go into this nondescript office complex, past a smiling state trooper who wands you in and check your bags. The office inside is as plain as a tax preparer's waiting room. Beige walls and carpeting. You walk past cubicles, past a few offices, and into this small conference room. And sitting around a conference table, squeezed there, are 13 board members sitting elbow to elbow. They hunch over laptops and coffee cups and fat accordion files with case documents that go back decades into the last century. The board members I observed in Illinois are a motley group. They're black and white and Latino. By law, they include both Republicans and Democrats. They're former public school teachers and school principals. They're guidance counselors, former prosecutors, and cops. As I said, the room is small. There's barely enough space for fold-out chairs set up behind the board members. And the visitors sitting in those chairs include the siblings or grandchildren of the parole candidates, and also the siblings or grandchildren of their victims. Again, this is a tiny room, and I want to emphasize what that's like to have these opposing family members being so close. They're never far apart. Families of parole candidates and families of victims are locked in the same process, year after year, decade after decade. They exchange greetings, they notice each other as they age, and also as some of them die off. In addition to the relatives, there are state's attorneys from the counties where the crimes were prosecuted. Like Wisconsin, Illinois got rid of parole decades ago. You all did it in 1999, we did it way back in 1978. Meaning, only people convicted of a felony before the law change are still allowed to come up for parole consideration, which means these cases are from a long, long time ago. Most of the prosecutors sitting there in that office, this is a pretty low-level job for the state's attorneys, they weren't working there when the cases went to trial. And in fact, often they weren't even born yet. And yet, they tend to characterize all parole candidates as clear and present dangers, no matter that most of the people they're talking about are now senior citizens. I want to say a little bit more about how parole works and how parole hearings work. A parole hearing isn't a trial. Most of us know that. At a trial, a court determines guilt or innocence. Parole, of course, comes way after that. Parole boards decide when a long prison sentence should finally end. Board members are supposed to examine how people have changed since their crime, how they've grown in prison, who they are today, and if they're ready to rejoin society, safely rejoin society. Parole is based on the philosophy that prisons do more than simply warehouse and punish. A prison's mission is supposed to be positive change, rehabilitation. We call our prisons correctional facilities, right? Guards are correctional officers. Parole boards, in theory at least, exist to assess this positive change. They're also meant to be in the business of corrections. But we know that's rarely the case. At parole hearings, there are all these competing stories being told about parole candidates. Of a crime, of time in prison, of victims, of remorse. The hearings are essentially storytelling contests. Who can tell a more compelling narrative about release or ongoing punishment? I'm a storyteller. It's essentially my job. And so here I am trying to tell you guys a story. And what's it about? In many ways, the story I'm trying to say is about storytelling itself. The stories we tell about crime and punishment. Which gets me back to the parole hearings. For parole candidates, the stakes could not be higher. Can you imagine this rare chance to somehow speak your way to freedom, to say the words that might open the prison doors? In Wisconsin, parole commissioners go into the prisons, meet individually with candidates, they interview them, and then make an independent decision about whether or not to grant release. Illinois works a little differently. Those up for parole don't attend their own hearings. That's a state law. So they get to tell their story to a board member who visits them in prison. Then that board member reports back to the rest of the board at the full hearing in Springfield, where there's debate and then a vote. You need a majority of the board members to go free. I said that parole is a contest of storytelling, but it's in no way a level playing field. The stories of past crimes always start way in the lead. When you're at the full hearings, you listen to a board member rehash one of these long ago crimes, even if the crime is 20 years old, even if it's 50 years old, you're teleported back in time. It's true, and it's, it could even be embarrassing to say, but we all know how true crime works. It's like you feel like you're reacting to the news of the violence like it just happened. Even though a crime is the one thing about a case that can never change no matter what, no matter how many years passed, it doesn't matter. The crime can feel permanently present tense. When parole boards anywhere in the US deny release, they usually use some variation of the exact same language. To parole the candidate at this time would deprecate the seriousness of the offense and promote disrespect for the law. To even consider granting release to the inmate would especially deprecate the serious nature of this crime. To parole him would deprecate the seriousness of these very violent, horrendous offenses and promote disrespect for the law. But come on, this is a paradox, because a terrible crime always remains a terrible crime. An offense doesn't become less serious over time. A crime by its very definition disrespects the law. And I want to pause on that for a moment, because that basically sums up the story of justice in America, and certainly over the past 5 decades of mass incarceration. Stories of crimes dominate our laws. Fear and outrage shape how we conceive of the purpose of prisons and how we consider release. Parole hearings, for better and for worse, beam a light on the enormous question of why we punish. The United States locks up 1 in 4 of the incarcerated people in the world. And this thing we do more than anyone else, we don't really have a good reason why we do it. Okay, let's go back to Springfield in the cramped office, the cramped room with the board members, because I want to tell you actually about the very first parole hearing I ever attended. This is in February of 2019, and in many ways, that hearing sent me on a 5-year odyssey that I think I'm still on. It's really why I'm here right now in front of you. It's what led me here. That first day, I watched as the parole board considered 7 cases. In 6 of them, parole was swiftly denied. To parole at this time would deprecate the seriousness of the offense and promote disrespect for the law. The seventh case was a parole applicant named Henry D. You won't have to remember his name, but I want to stay in his case for a bit. Henry D. was convicted of a double murder, of the killing of a cab driver and the cabbie's wife, and that was back in 1972, when Henry D. was 25. At the time of this parole hearing, he was 72, and he had spent 46 years in prison. A couple of the board members started talking about the candidate's record behind bars, which was remarkable. In 5 decades of incarceration, Henry D. had just a handful of disciplinary tickets, which is incredibly low. The board member who interviewed Henry D. in prison was one of the first Latina lawyers ever in Illinois. Her name is Virginia Martinez. As far as how often the board members vote for release, vote for parole, Martinez, admittedly, was somewhere in the middle. She told me once about her fears of making what she called a mistake, of recommending someone for release who went on to commit a violent crime. At Henry D.'s hearing, though, Martinez couldn't believe that the parole candidate had so few tickets in Stateville, which is one of our maximum security prisons. It's one of a notorious prison. She said it with such disbelief. In Stateville. She was actually acknowledging the absurdity of what the board was supposed to do. That they evaluate a person's worthiness for release based on their good or bad conduct inside of prisons, places that usually demand people be their worst. At the hearing, as the board members discussed the case, Martinez said she was going to vote to free Henry D. That was one vote for him. He needed 7. But there was something else about the parole candidate that gave other board members pause. Henry D. insisted all these years later that he didn't do the crime in 1972 that got him sent to prison. He still said Chicago police officers had planted evidence on him, that he was framed, which meant this guy faced a dilemma. Parole is not set up to examine innocence. It's way easier to tell a story, it's way easier to tell a parole board a convincing story of repentance or remorse. Because, as most of us know here, an innocence claim does something else. It requires that the justice system examine itself. It calls into question the work of police officers, of prosecutors, of judges, as well as, in a case like this, all those previous parole board members who voted against release. At his previous parole hearings, Henry D. was even told that if he didn't acknowledge committing the crime, he would never be paroled. And so on this day, the board members reviewing Henry D.'s case traveled back in time to the original conviction. And the details of that crime again sent them down the rabbit hole of retrying that ancient case. They weren't considering the candidate's record in prison any longer. They weren't considering his rehabilitation or who he was today. They were focused instead on the police reports, the details of the arrest, and with that, any support of releasing this guy just seemed to disappear. But there was another wrinkle in the case I was watching that day. And this is when I first recognized parole as something transformative. Henry D. had a co-defendant, James Sales. You don't have to remember that name either. Only that the two of them were convicted for committing the crime together. And for decades, the co-defendant also swore that he was innocent. Their stories lined up. Then about 20 years ago, James Sales did a 180. He said they did do it, they were guilty. And soon after that, he got paroled. A board member at the hearing I was watching suddenly spoke up. She asked if she could offer up a theory. She said, maybe we want to take into consideration that Henry D.'s co-defendant took the advice about admitting guilt, that the other man said he did the crime, even if he didn't, just so that he could make parole. It was like the lights in the room suddenly flashed on. Board members started shouting, yes, and that's what I was gonna say. It was as if the board members had been waiting for a convincing story, one that might allow at least some of them to move beyond that story of the crime. The deliberation continued for a little bit longer and then wrapped. The board chairman called for a vote. There was a former Chicago police officer on the board. He always showed up to hearings wearing a tracksuit. When it was his turn to vote, he said, I think D is dirty, but I'm still going to vote for him. His colleagues laughed. 9 of 13 board members ended up voting for release. Henry D. went free. That's how parole hearings work. They can be that fickle. A person's freedom can hinge on one board member speaking up, or by what's going on in the world right then, by politics or, say, a sensational crime that's in the news. What becomes justice is that arbitrary. But that was also the moment I knew I stumbled onto something astonishing. Here were these board members at the back end of the justice system with a broad range of experiences and views. Each case they considered looked back on the full sweep of the criminal system: an arrest, a trial, decades in prison. The parole board members, like all of us, are steeped in an American culture in which extreme prison sentences have become the norm. But then there were moments like this that felt like grace. Here was the justice system in all its fevered conceptions of safety and punishment, and I just watched a 46-year prison sentence end. So what can we take away from this story I'm telling? Many of us know from our own work and our own struggles that an individual act of mercy, as powerful and transformative as it can be, is not the same thing as a system of second chances. It's an exception to the rule. So how do we change the system? I don't actually know. That's a really big ask. But I do want to double down on this idea of storytelling, and it already came up tonight. On the way we talk about crime and the way we talk about people convicted of violent offenses. Because we need better stories. We need better stories about criminal justice in America. And that's a lesson from parole hearings. We can't keep on going back to the original crime. We can't continue to allow fear and outrage to define our notions of justice, to shape our values, to shape our laws, to fuel the backlashes that undercut even modest reforms. We all need to be involved in telling those better stories. And most of us already are, about Marcy's Law, for instance. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to do with this book, and even standing in front of you. But we also have to do more of it. We have to do it better. In just the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen whiplashing reversals, both ways, one way and then another, in how criminal justice is discussed. In Wisconsin, in Illinois, and elsewhere, we need more opportunities for second chances. We know there are thousands of people growing old in prison who are serving extremely long prison sentences that treat people as if they're incapable of change. The second chances could include reinstating parole, bringing parole back in our states for everybody. The second chances could also involve new second look resentencing hearings. Those would be first steps, but huge ones. We also know that prisons can actually focus on rehabilitation and release. That might seem far-fetched in the United States, but it's not some fantasy. I visited prisons in countries such as Finland and Norway, and from the moment a person is incarcerated there, everything is focused on restoring them to useful citizenship. That successful return to society is as much about public safety as human rights, a way to ensure that people won't go on to commit more crime, that they're out in the world adding to society. I'll say one last thing about the parole system. I've now spent years examining it. I can tell you definitively that parole decisions can be racially biased, completely focused on the original crime, and just random. But even knowing this, I think we'd be better off with it. Because after 50 years of mass incarceration, we need more release valves from prison. And because I believe prisons should have a positive purpose beyond warehousing indefinitely, and like all of us, I also believe in second chances. And in that sense, I believe at least in the promise of parole. Thank you. because we're such a small group and because we have time, I'm happy to take questions and have a conversation up here. We have a microphone.
Hello.
Hi, thank you for coming. So the only people who remain in prison and are eligible for parole are basically old people,
Yes.
or at least people not in the crime committee years. What do we do about everyone else? I mean, it seems, maybe this is naive of me, but it seems like that's a relatively small population of prisoners. How does the correction system really begin to correct people's behavior, prepare them for release, and then allow that release when the laws have changed and all require what they call truth in sentencing, which is no possibility of parole?
Yeah, it's a great question. I can repeat it too. So here and in Illinois and elsewhere, federally too, where parole has been eliminated, people have come up who only have been convicted before the law change. So you're right. I mean, in Illinois, people have been convicted before 1978. They've done at least 40 years. Most of them are in their late 60s or even older. And it's a relatively small population. And so what to do about the vast majority? In the long term, I certainly hope, most of us here, we're working on changing truth in sentencing laws, mandatory minimums, but we still have hundreds of thousands of people in prison across the country who are serving, carrying the weight of the last 50 years of mass incarceration, who are serving incredible sentences. We do need to figure out ways to get second chances. And so reinstating parole for everybody, giving them an opportunity, having second look hearings, actually coming before a judge, and those seem like the possibilities. Certainly isn't coming through clemency or anything like that. So we do need the hundreds of thousands of people who are serving these sentences, and even if their law changes, something has to happen to get them out in their lifetime. In Illinois, people in prison are now advocating and fighting to reinstate the parole system, which, as some of you might know, is kind of a reversal of what happened in the 1970s and 80s when people in prison were advocating for its abolition. She's going about it.
Hello.
Hey.
Hey, how everybody doing? I think my question is, you covered how we have to go to the parole hearing, right? So I'm somebody who sits in med path that I did 20 years in prison. One of the things that I question about is that even going through parole, you still had a PRC, which is a program review committee, which you have a series, as he said, of 12, you have a series of 5 people. And the 5 people can be a social worker, it can be the janitor, it can be the white shirt, which is the security director, and it can be a program coordinator who is a PRC lady. These same people that we have to relive the same story over and over, even 6 months or a year. My question is that even on parole in PRC, why do we have to go through so many different levels of group of individuals to relive a story that we're supposed to be not living? So every time I did, so for 20 years, every time I went to CPRC, I had to relive my story to a different group of individuals who asked me, did I do this? What is going on? What have I done wrong? And at the same time, like he said in parole, is that I had to sit there and lie to them and say that I'm changed, even though I didn't do it. So my question is that in the series of us going home or reintegrating back to society, why do we have a parole committee and a PRC committee, but the judge that we're being sentenced told us this is what the law looks like, but once we go into the DOC or Department of Corrections, wherever you want to call it, everything changed what the judge has said?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, I talked about the return to the original crime, and victims' rights has come up tonight already about the power of it and their presence in parole hearings, which starts really in the 70s and 80s, to ensure that we We stick on the crime over and over again. What you're describing, you could imagine if we had a parole system in these two states, the hope is then we would have to, as it being a first step, and what we would do next is we would have to reform it somehow, to both ensure that people who served on the board were just, were open to listening to considering release and change. But also, if you had a parole system that worked, you would enter on day one of prison and you would learn what you would have to do, you would hear what you'd have to do to get released. No state does that. Montana does that a little bit, but I'm talking about this is the thing that you're preparing for, and yet nobody is telling what you do or giving you the resources to do it. If those resources existed, the system might be better. You're also describing a process of reliving trauma over and over again. You can imagine a piece of that being actually constructive. Not for innocence cases, because that's a parole system just isn't set up for that. But I work with some groups that help people in prison prepare for their parole hearings. And part of it is really trauma-informed, of coming to terms with your past, of how you've been victimized, and really learning about yourself in a therapeutic way. That would be powerful.
Thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
In 2016, I learned that a client that I'd represented in a 1990 homicide had passed away. Like the case you described, he was a co-defendant. My client pled to a first-degree reckless homicide. He went to prison, did his time, was released, then he passed away. His co-defendant was a teenager who, with the advice of his attorney, pled to first-degree intentional homicide. In the state of Wisconsin, there's only one penalty for that, a life sentence. But I knew something. I went to my former client's family, and I had various people aid us in this, and I obtained their consent to reveal what I had learned from my client decades ago. And so I went to the then parole commissioner for the state of Wisconsin, okay? And I supplied all that information. It took a little bit of time, but the parole commissioner authorized parole for Mr. Reed in 2017. He has not, as best I can tell, ever violated any of the conditions of his parole. But I want everyone in this room to know that the parole commissioner who took, if you want to call it, that chance or understood the opportunity is seated right here. It's the Honorable Dan Gabler. He granted that parole. And mind you, this is at a time when the then governor wouldn't even consider pardons, wouldn't even accept applications, despite the fact that that was his constitutional obligation to do so, wouldn't do it. So Judge Gabler, he was a judge for a while too, I can only imagine the pressure that he must have been under not to do that, but he did the right thing.
Yes. Those are the kind of stories, when I'm saying we need to tell better stories like that. Yeah. Parole from its origins and continues to be, can act as a correction on the whole system. When things are egregious, I watched people who were sent away with 3 strike laws, and the parole board just say, this is ridiculous, and grant release. It's the power that someone sitting in that seat can do. You can correct these mistakes from the last 30, 40 years.
I just wanted to thank you for coming today. I have a couple of statements more rather than questions. I feel the only way to be able to help the truth in sentencing convictions return home is to create a retroactive law that would be beneficial for them for everything after TS1. Second off, I wanted to say another issue that needs to be addressed is the wide range or the latitude that administrative law judges have on revocations for people who are out on supervision. I mean, people are getting revoked on allegations with no crime has been committed. Police won't charge the defendant, and they're still getting revoked. And then lastly, I just would like to thank Ellen for inviting me today. For anybody who doesn't know, this is my sentencing judge in 2010. So we talk about full circle type situations. But I mean, working like this, changes can be made. So thank you.
Thanks, Dan. That's very, very kind of you. I just want to add to his comments. I don't know why we don't have good time credit for time on supervision. And if Wisconsin Justice Initiative wants to pair with the Badger Institute on this reform, I think they're interested in it too. I'd be your testifying former judge. I think that would be a small thing that we could do.
Hi. So I just wanted to say that about a year ago, I attended a presentation from the former executive director of a group called the Ohio Policy and Justice Center, which is based in Cincinnati, Ohio. They mostly do innocence cases, but they started a project there called Beyond Guilt. And in the Beyond Guilt project, what they did was they represented clients who had been serving lengthy prison sentences and who had no route to getting out under the parole system, and they had no route under a sentence modification, which is pretty much the case in Wisconsin as well. But they had successfully gotten 50 people out of prison over the course of, I'm not sure how many years of working on it, but I could see potential for doing that, and I think it would, in order to be successful like this, it's something that I think we would need some cooperation between prosecutors, maybe former judges, maybe former prosecutors, members of the defense bar, because they figured out a way to work around, and I think we can figure out a way to work around what they call the new factor. Lawyers here know what I'm talking about, I won't get into it, but they were very successful, and I see some possibilities for doing it, and I've thought about founding a nonprofit in Milwaukee to do something like that, and I think it would be very worthwhile work, working with clients who, were guilty, got long sentences, and have been rehabilitated, and there's quite a few of them out there who, we're just wasting our money and their lives by incarcerating them.
So, first of all, I don't know what anybody here knows about. I've never been in the state system, but I know that the Wisconsin Department of Corrections is not rehabilitating anybody. And I say that because how do you rehabilitate somebody that's never been habilitated? We're coming from environments that trauma is our everyday factor that causes us to commit crimes that we do to go to prison. How do you rehabilitate someone who's never been habilitated? What we're doing is warehousing our people in these prisons. And the numbers of people of color that are in there are astronomical. Now, we got a lot of people in there that have been deported for years, but are still doing time. I got guys from the neighborhood that have been deported since, I know a guy that's been deported since 2004, but isn't eligible for parole until 2065. So we're gonna house him in this prison system until 2065 to send him back to his home country. Well, why don't we send them all back to their home countries? And if they come back, then now they got to deal with the feds. It's not a state issue anymore. That's a federal issue. I know that because I did 17 years in the feds. And I've seen guys doing 20 years for reentry. So we're wasting money housing these guys that are from other countries for whatever the reason that they went in there for is irrelevant. You're wasting our taxpayer money to house these guys that you could have sent back to their home countries. a long time. As soon as the judge deports them, ICE should be coming to get them and send them over there. But we warehouse them until their parole dates. And then they don't get deported on their first parole date. They get a 5-year hit. They get a 10-year hit. So now he's sitting at 2070 before he can get deported. He came in at 18 in 1993. He's got to wait till 2065 to get deported. It doesn't make sense to me. We wasted all this money for no reason, and they complain about not having enough money to house all these inmates. We got all these people that shouldn't be housed. You're not paroling anybody. You're not giving anybody supervised release, extended parole. You're not giving them nothing. You're making them sit in there, and you don't have no programs for them. If you're just going to warehouse people, then say that's what we're doing. We're warehousing them. Keep it clean. But if we're talking about rehabilitating people, let's put programming in there and get them rehabilitated, or get them habilitated to come out and be productive out here. There's nothing out here as far as programming for young kids to go through anymore. When I was coming up, we had all kinds of programs. I'm a 70s baby. In the 90s, they cut all that stuff out. So what are they going to do with their free time? Go out on the streets. Now, because you're black and brown, the police already see you as doing something wrong because you're in a group. So there's your first strike, right? We keep wasting money, sending all these men and women to prison when there could be other programs to get them to do things differently when they're out here. So we got to consider that. If money is a factor, consider what's really wasting all the money in there.
Thank you for that. That sense of a story is what I've been trying to say. It's just what we do is so abnormal. It's not normal. We have to say that over and over again. It's an aberration in our own history and compared to the rest of the world. What you just described, we have to keep on announcing that. This isn't normal. It's not productive. Thank you.
So I have a question. I'm not an attorney, but my question is, why is the United States so incarceration crazy? All the other countries have mentally ill people, angry people, people that don't have services, etc., and yet they don't have hundreds of thousands of people in prison. I don't understand. And you kind of touched on it with, I think, Finland. Is that where you went?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, one answer is racism, that many of those other countries are much more homogenous. But that actually doesn't fully explain our own history. For most of the 20th century, our prison numbers were pretty stable. We had other things in place, and a segregated kind of apartheid, but we didn't have numbers like we did. We had 200,000 people in prison in the 1970s, which was actually the exact same amount that Finland had at that point. And so we went up from 200,000 to 1.6 million, and now to 1.2 million. When the United States and Finland both had 200,000 people in prison, and which was considered relatively high in the 1970s, Finland had just broken away from the Soviet Union and was trying to be more like its Scandinavian neighbors. So it thought about these reforms that we have to invest in, not just prison reforms, but actually let's invest in a welfare state like Sweden and these other countries. And at the same time that they both were going to change their prisons, and it was really like small changes to reduce their prison numbers. It was 5 years and not having an extra add-on and some alternative to prisons. It wasn't anything radical, but they invested in social services and a social safety net. And our history is a totally different trajectory. That at the same time, prison numbers, and we're investing in police, and we're cutting all these social services. It's what this man just said here, that we don't have what's going on in these communities. And that's how we get where we are. I mean, that's a huge part of it. It's not just It's not just believing in punishment, but it's taking away all these things that we know reduce crime, that we know make people thrive. So.
Ben, thanks very much. Really appreciate it.